Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on using workplace analytics to build trust and empower employees. I'm Julia King, a technology researcher and writer, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. So on to our topic. With the increase in remote work brought on by COVID-19, many organizations have realized they need new ways to understand and to measure productivity. This has worked to significantly sharpen executive focus on workplace analytics, and this is happening across all industries. Workplace analytics is what enables businesses to use data from multiple systems, ranging from HR applications to cloud-based platforms such as Slack, Zoom, or Teams, to identify collaboration patterns that impact productivity as well as workforce effectiveness. Among other things, analytics can help pinpoint where there's a potential for worker burnout and identify where additional resources may be required. Analytics also enable organizations to keep a continuous pulse on employee engagement. Whether teams are working in a traditional office setting, from home, or a hybrid combination, there is no substitute for having actual data to understand productivity, focus, burnout risk, and other key organizational health metrics. So in this webinar, you'll gain insights into using data to measure productivity, engagement, and wellness, and balancing the flexibility that employees desire with the visibility that businesses need. You'll gain insights into relevant legal issues, such as informed consent and public disclosure, and approaches for using workplace analytics successfully across remote, hybrid, and in-office environments. Our presenters are Michael Schrage, the visiting scholar, MIT Sloan Initiative on the digital economy, and Gabriela Mauch, who is vice president at ActivTrak's Productivity Lab. That's a dedicated team focused on helping organizations transition to a productivity-oriented mindset. Michael, Gabriela, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for the setup. I'm going to take the liberty of elaborating on it before Gabriela unpacks the agenda that we have. I want to double down on what Julia's observed, because I think we're in the midst of an ongoing digital and data revolution regarding, and it's been expanded and exacerbated by the pandemic, about how do we instrument and measure customer experience, how do we instrument and measure employee experience. How do we get better at that? How do we use the data generated to become more productive? And how do we know? How do we know? So the session that you're going to hear, we're going to be asking you to answer some questions that we have in this regard, but our major motivation for doing this is that there's a real alignment challenge between customer experience and employee experience. And as one looks at digital transformation pioneers and leaders, the Amazons, the Ubers, I just had a dealing with Clutter the other day, which is a packing organization where literally the workforce people take photos of the stuff they're moving and they measure the volume of the boxes to see if you have enough room in storage. As you look at what's going on to support and augment the workforce, how are we using analytics to really strike a balance between productivity, wellness, and other variables? What is the real purpose of these analytics? What is the real point of this data collection? And if you'll forgive the Latin phrase, cui bono, who benefits? Clearly, there needs to be a rethinking and rebalancing of managerial control versus employee empowerment, and what kind of visibility and transparency is needed to support that. I think increasingly, we're not going to be able to tell people that they're going to be monitored and they're going to be tracked. I think increasingly we're going to have to ask people about that. And I think what you're going to hear Gabriela elaborate on and us kibitz on is our approaches to meaningfully, proactively, constructively doing that. Because my personal / professional opinion is the role of analytics predominantly for control is not sustainable. it's not sustainable. So with that kind of setup, can I hand it over to you, Gabriela?
Of course. Julia, thank you for the kind introduction. Michael, thanks for setting us up here. Let's go into the agenda and walk through what we're going to be talking about today in a bit more detail. First, we're going to highlight the concepts that we'd like to unpack as they relate to digital behavior analytics. From there, we'll talk a bit about, taking a step back, what the employee experience landscape looks like that Michael just mentioned, and how some of these key concepts begin to come together. What we'd like to do today is to make sure that we're placing digital behavioral analytics and workplace analytics into the context of a broader conversation that's happening in our organizations. And so once we do that, we'll return back to these concepts we're looking to unpack, and we'll dig a little bit deeper before closing out on some key takeaways. I'd like to highlight that today's conversation is certainly meant to be a participative one. And so we'd encourage you to participate in the polls as we move through today and make sure that we can make this a guided discussion, certainly with your input as we touch upon these key topics. Let's talk a bit about these concepts that we're looking to unpack. Here in front of you, we have 4 key concepts. We have flexibility and visibility, productivity insights and trust insights, ownership, monitoring strategy, and monitoring capability. These 4 concepts have a level of interconnectivity across each of them. And today we'll talk about not only them as individual topics, but certainly how they relate to one another. To step back, I want to talk about where we were a bit 18 months ago when we were looking at March of 2020, and we were in a bit of a state of panic as overnight our workplaces shifted from what many of us took place in the office to what immediately was suddenly at home. And so I think what I want to do today is I want to set the tone for normalizing certainly what we all went through in some capacity, which was a state of panic. Suddenly, the pulse that we had on our organizations for years, which included being able to see people in the office, work alongside an agreement around core working hours, that it was eliminated. And so what we did in that state of panic is that we reached for a level of control. And that control came from a variety of capacities. For some of us, that was making sure that all of a sudden when we had weekly team meetings, that shifted from daily team meetings, right? And managers struggled to figure out how they could get a pulse on what their workforce was doing. 18 months later, as we shift into really determining what the future of work is going to look like, we're beginning to start thinking about how we can shift away from the panic and the control that we set on our workforces to thinking strategically about a level of a set of controls that we can put in place so that we can have a level of visibility into our workforce so that we could provide things like support when it's needed most. And so what we want to do today is we want to shift away from that concept of having control to a concept of thinking about a set of controls that we can put in place so that our employees can have the tailored, timely, and necessary support that they need as we ask them to work in these hybrid and remote work environments.
I'm going to take the liberty of interjecting here, Gabriela, because I think that what you said was accurate but too polite. We had managements and yes, leaderships panic. They didn't have situational awareness. How could they get situational awareness? They were using technology to gain greater visibility into their employees who they could literally no longer see at the workplace. So they had to get some sort of way of monitoring and accessing them. So it's not that this was bad or evil or wrong, but this control emphasis was born of panic. Presumably, hopefully, we're not as panicked now. And so the issue that we're confronting is really doubling down or extending or deepening control the right way to go? I think you won't be surprised to hear that our answer is no, but I think you really do want to pay attention to the diagram that Gabriela has shared here, because your monitoring and strategy and capability enormously influences the kind of insights you're going to have and the sort of flexibility and visibility you and your employees both want to have, not to mention ownership and accountability. Sorry for that, but I just think you were being too nice, and I'm the person who errs on the side of not being nice.
No reason to be sorry at all. Thank you. I'd love to hear from the audience. I think that's a great spot to transition here as we turn it over to those participating today in terms of just what are your greatest fears about monitoring. And so, Michael, I think it'd be great if we got that foundation for those that are on the line here, and we can build off of that.
Yes, we didn't I didn't emphasize the monitoring issue by accident, but it's very, very interesting because we've now been living in, whether it's hybrid or remote, we're now living in a monitored, some people would even use the word surveilled environment. What is your greatest concern for? Is it around the legal implications, the cultural implications, your customer or brand implications? What about how managers are trained or held responsible, or the trust and leadership? We've got answers already.
And cultural implications looks like our highest here. What's your reaction to that, Michael and Gabriela?
Leadership trust, which I would not divorce from cultural implications. Wow.
Yeah, I think this certainly comes as no surprise to me, Julia. I think it's interesting, when I think about the customers that we see today, what comes to mind, I'd love to share an anecdote here about one particular customer who is certainly engaging in using workplace analytics in their day-to-day, has really put a substantial emphasis on building a program that takes into account the cultural implications and the leadership trusts that are top of mind as it pertains to monitoring. Oftentimes when we think about using workplace analytics, it becomes essential that we think about them not as a standalone tool, but rather as an enabler to a program that takes into account making sure that we are consistently communicating as leaders to our workforce around what the analytics say, that we're taking action based on the analytics that we see, and that we're communicating the purpose and the reason for why we're using monitoring so that culturally we feel as if it's something that enables us rather than hinders us. I think those two certainly for me don't come as a surprise. And I think that they're certainly important to be top of mind. So I'm glad to see them show up here. We'll cover that quite a bit in today's conversation.
I'm actually a little surprised on this. Can we go back to that for one moment? I'm actually a little surprised. I would have thought, I'm not surprised that leadership and cultural are up there. I would have thought they'd be a little more concerned about the customer implications and the manager training things. Those are literally single-digit issues. Legal, there's always going to be a legal issue. To me, the alarm bell here is, do people trust leaders to monitor appropriately, to monitor in ways that are in the interests of the people who are monitored, the workforce that is monitored, rather than just to expand the boundaries of control for the management and leaders. And the second, of course, are the cultural implications of that. So this is an alarm bell for me. And I think going forward, the issue of how can we build better trust is going to be absolutely key. And I would urge you to have that emphasis in mind as you further unpack our framework here, Gabriela.
Great, thank you. Let's pan out for a little bit before we get into the concepts that we'd like to unpack and talk a little bit about employee experience, because over time in the last 18 months, we've really seen the definition of employee experience take on a new shape. At one point, employee life cycle was really, or employee experience was really defined by making sure that we could think about the employee life cycle via system processing. So we talked a lot about what HRIS systems were in place, how we were processing payroll, how we were really looking at the employee experience from cradle to grave, but really measuring it through milestones. So thinking about the employee experience from the day that they were hired to the day that onboarding ended, to the promotions that were documented and the pay increases throughout their experience. Very system milestone-like was our way that we were defining employee experience. Today, our consideration for employees goes far beyond. In fact, we're thinking about employee experience less so by the milestones that take place and more so by the things that take place in between those milestones. When we think about between the milestones, that's where we really hone in on the employee experience. How engaged are our employees? Are they facing burnout? Are they properly utilized? What's going on in their actual experience as they're working within our organizations? And so that definition of employee experience expands to cover these 6 key topics, certainly not limited to, but these topics likely are very familiar to us as we think about the employee experience today. When we think about measuring employee experience, we think about these 6 key boxes and the metrics that we collect. We think about acquisition, retention, and attrition metrics, so our talent management metrics. We think about compensation and benefits, learning and development, how much we're investing into learning and development, who's consuming our learning and development opportunities, in what way are they consuming them. We look at D&I metrics today to tell us how we're prioritizing diversity and inclusion across our workplace. And of course, we use things like engagement surveys to better understand the degree of engagement that's happening in our workforce. For us, when we think about employee experience, we recognize that it's not only important to be taking action on these things, but it's also important to be measuring it.
So Gabriela, there's all sorts of reasons to measure these components of employee experience. Why are organizations doing so? And are you seeing this increasing?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's certainly a greater emphasis on analytics and data today, Julia, than there has been before. I think we look to measure these things because we want to be thoughtful both reactively and perhaps even more importantly, proactively. It's important to understand, particularly in this era recently coined, right, as the Great Resignation, right? It's important to understand how our employees are doing as frequently as we can so that when we want to take action, it's something that we're in a good position to go ahead and do in a timely and relevant way. Yeah. Reactively, we look at things like engagement. Proactively, we're also looking at things based on trends that have happened in our past to think about how we can solve for them in the future. Michael, I'd encourage you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question as well.
To chip in here again because you know, you're on brand in terms of being nice on these things. I think, Julia, the answer based on the experience I have in advisory work and in exec ed is that people measure because they can. They're collecting these things. They're doing this. Yes, we want to know what our churn is. Yes, we want to be able to show that we have diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. Yes, we want to be able to demonstrate that our employees are engaged. But the linkage, and I think this is a point that we're going to further develop, but the linkage between measurement and actionable insights is not as clear to me. Partly because this is siloed. Self-serve management, talent management, learning and development are handled by different aspects of HR, different parts of the organization. Sometimes HR is more compliance-oriented than people-oriented. And I think this is one of the real issues. And I think it goes into the trust issue. Why do we measure? You know, I talked about situational measure to create a bias for action, to support a strategy. I'm going to argue that right now, the real focus is on situational awareness, not on a bias for action. And most organizations that I spend time with don't even have a measurement strategy to speak of. So I'm very curious what people in the audience think, but I'm kind of cynical about this. I think employee experience is a great organizing principle, but are we taking advantage of it? And I think that's what Gabriela is going to expand on next.
That's a great segue here. What I'd like to highlight next is what we call here the employee experience analytics blind spot. And it was as if Michael knew potentially what the next slide was. Right. So the idea here is that
isn't that shocking?
When we think about measurement, you know, we really have to start thinking about it more importantly from that situational awareness angle. And when we do that, we find that the metrics that we have today, while helpful, are not entirely holistic. What's missing is ongoing real-time behavioral insights so that leaders, managers, and employees can provide and or request ongoing real-time support. Now, what's on the right-hand side of this slide here is worth taking a minute to digest. It's important to recognize that ongoing and real-time insights aren't just to benefit the leader, and they're not just to benefit the employee. In fact, when we think about them that way, we often fall short and fail to overcome some of those cultural implications that I think many of you have cited as being concerned about. When we think about using ongoing real-time behavioral insights, it's important that we think about them for our entire organization rather than one particular stakeholder group. And when we do that, that contributes to the trust and transparency that we're looking to bring to the forefront.
I want to double down on what you just said there, Gabriela, because you used the C word. I'm going to use the L word. You talked about the cultural implications. This is where leaders have to step up. Leaders have to make clear, both in terms of communication and the way they lead by example, that if we as leaders care about employee experience, we are gathering this real-time data, we are generating these insights as much for your benefit as for my benefit, for our benefit. And if leaders don't make that absolutely bloody clear in writing, on video, in their actions, they will fail. They will not achieve the holistic integration of employee experience as opposed to a bunch of silos that you've described.
Excellent. Thank you. One of the things that when you say that rises up for me, Michael, is this idea that when we think about these metrics, it's not a one or the other type of discussion. I'm not saying that the metrics that we have on this slide are useless so much as I'm saying that they can be supplemented in a way that they're far more holistic so that leaders can not only talk about what has happened, but also can have a conversation about what is happening. And so I think that that's a really important piece to highlight. It's certainly no surprise that as the participants here are talking about cultural implications, are also talking about leadership and trust. And so what you've done here is you've certainly tied the two as being, quite dependent on one another.
Exactly.
Gabriela, let me ask, why do you think it is that so many organizations leave this real-time behavioral aspect out? What's the challenge there? Why is this missing in so many cases?
Julia, I think it's because we're not having many conversations like the ones that we're having today. I think that when we start measuring things real time, with that comes a level of responsibility on the part of leadership to take action. And that's not only is that a heavy responsibility, but it requires some time and commitment that I'm not sure everyone has necessarily thought about how they're going to provide that.
I'll be blunter on that. It is shocking to me, much the same way the leadership number was shocking to me. It is shocking to me how few organizations look for interesting patterns or correlations between engagement and DE&I and learning and development. They're handled and managed separately. They're aggregated as opposed to correlated. People are not necessarily looking for inferences and causal mechanisms that link these disparate metrics. And that is why the role of monitoring is so important, because it gives us the data. It allows us to have data to make more meaningful pattern recognition, more meaningful correlations, more meaningful inferences about what a better and more productive employee experience may be.
Well, let's move to the next poll when we find out from our audience what kinds of real-time methods they might have in place.
I will be holding my breath on this one. I'm very curious.
Yes, we're asking our audience to select one. Do you use real-time methods to measure the effectiveness of employee experience efforts?
I'm really curious to dig deeper on this one, Michael and Julia, in terms of just understanding, what our interpretation is of real-time methods, right? And so for some of us, the interpretation of real-time, I think, varies, and perhaps we dig a little bit into that once we see the results here.
Right. And if people want to clarify these things in the chat or the questions, they should do so.
Oh, and the results are up here. 33%, a full third, routinely use engagement surveys. How do these results strike you? Do they surprise you? And can you speak to some of the methods from your experience, the quality of some of the methods from your experience?
Can
I
I?
think,
You go ahead.
I'll take the first stab at it here, Michael. My initial reaction is that the engagement survey has been a powerful way over the past decade to really start getting a pulse on how employees are feeling. And I think that those sentiments become very powerful because, as we all know, how employees are feeling is an indicator of things such as engagement and retention. And it's important to understand those pieces. That number doesn't come as much of a surprise to me. That being said, I think when we think about engagement surveys, again, oftentimes a bit reactive and a bit circumstantial, right? If someone is filling that out on one particular day, representative of 6 months, I think that or an entire year, I tend to find that they're a bit difficult. Wouldn't necessarily classify them as real time, though we gave them as an option. So we gave that as an option. So I think it's useful to see that people have selected that and such a high number has selected that.
So my reaction is actually the absence of shock. This is almost exactly what I would have expected. My only mild surprise is that there aren't more people routinely use engagement surveys, because it's an easy thing to do. You get your Qualtrics, you get your Survey Monkey, you do your pulse thing, yes, no, whatever, you're fine on this. But let's break this down. Not even 15% of the people on this call have organizations that monitor or do real analytics. Okay, that's not a lot. A third, literally a third, use engagement surveys. The same handful that train for employee feedback is doing productivity analytics. I will bet you there's an 80% correlation between that 15% and that 13%. The answer that surprises me the least is we don't have a defined way to measure effectiveness, a third. I think that understates the number. So really, we are undervaluing, we are underutilizing the data and analytics assets that we have and the capabilities that we have, both on the effectiveness axis and on the employee experience axis. That is a huge deal. That is a huge deal. And we need to get better.
Well, moving forward here, is there an agreement that is needed or something that needs to be put in place in terms of monitoring if more organizations are to monitor?
I think so, Julia. I think that really what this comes down to is addressing the level of fear that has really taken hold here around the concept of monitoring. And if we don't take that head on, then we really do a disservice to thinking about how we can create an environment in which monitoring can be that key enabler so that it can be used, as Michael has outlined for us, as really the weaving mechanism across these different employee experience metrics that exist today. When we create an environment in which we have trust, empowerment, and accountability, all three in a level of balance, we create that environment in which monitoring has a better opportunity to really be successful. And I think, Michael, you and I have had this conversation a handful of times about how, as a standalone, when we just talk about each of these topics, they oftentimes become sort of this intangible word that we use when we're talking about things as they pertain to culture.
Oh, we need to trust, empower, accountability. What we have done here, what Gabriela and I have done here, we're biting the bullet on this. I'll push the envelope here. If you are not explicitly linking how your monitoring and analytics empower, how they build trust, and for whom and how they create accountability, these are interdependent. If you run this as silos, you will fail. It's dysfunctional. How do you strike a balance? You can strike a different balance. It doesn't have to be an equilateral triangle, with apologies to those who skipped geometry. It doesn't have to be an isosceles triangle. It doesn't have to be a right angle triangle. But there better be a balance here between empowerment, accountability, and trust. And if your monitoring and analytics policies, your employee experience metrics don't articulate a balance, we think you're going to fail. We don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, I know. I talk a little bit about, kind of where I've seen this, right? Because Michael, I think we often, this construct is a result not only of what you've seen in your experience, but also what I've seen in terms of those organizations that monitor successfully. Oftentimes when we look at these three concepts in application, for me, what it screams as I work my way around the triangle here is when it comes to trust, it's effective communication from leadership. When it comes to empowerment, it's, thinking about particular organizations that provide managers with training, not only around how to use monitoring analytics to identify ways in which employees need support, but also to engage in the conversations that need to accompany the analytics. When I think about companies that use monitoring successfully, they're empowering their managers to not only interpret the data, they're empowering their managers to take action on the data. That starts with conversations with their employees, and that then ends with a follow-through action that's essential to building the trust here that they're looking to establish. From an accountability standpoint, these organizations are looking at goal setting, and they're looking at the data as a way to think about not only where their baseline is, but where they'd like to take their organization. So I just want to highlight that in terms of, in practice, we see the organizations that monitor successfully are really focused on taking these three elements and bringing them to life.
I could not agree with you more. I think that's beautifully articulated. And I just want to underscore and highlight your empowerment point, because remember, only 13% of the people responding to the poll on this call said that managers are trained for encouraging feedback in that regard. That's not
what's interesting too is that when we think about empowerment, I myself, you certainly just did this, and the example I gave is that I talked about the manager, and I talked about empowering the manager to view the data. Empowerment is a two-way thing, right? And so when we talk about empowerment and you start thinking about your own monitoring strategy, it's important not to look at it for only a single stakeholder group. Empowerment needs to exist on the part of the manager as well as the employee for this to be successful. So our most successful customers here at ActivTrak are not only putting the data in the hands of their manager, but they're putting personal insights dashboards right in the hands of the employee on a weekly basis. So that employee also has the opportunity to view the same data that their manager is looking at to make sure that they can have transparent discussions on a routine basis.
Are you saying democratization of data and analytics, Gabriela?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Well, it sounds like visibility is absolutely key there. And I know that our audience will have a lot of questions which we want to get to. We started out talking about some of the key concepts here, flexibility, visibility, ownership. Which of these are most top of mind and are most important to address at this point? Let's ask our audience, which of these are most top of mind for them?
Perfect. Well, we poll the audience, Julia. I'll give us lay some groundwork in terms of how we're going to finish out today's presentation. What we're going to do is, we'd like to hear from the participants on what are the topics based on the framework that we've given you that are most top of mind. And then, Michael, you and I, let's guide the discussion based on what the poll gives us here, and we'll take us right up to the Q&A. Well, we certainly won't get to all of them. I think it will be important to make sure that our participants are getting out of this what's on their mind.
We're happy to show, but we view this as an effort, an exercise in empowering our audience to have them vote on what we discuss.
Okay, so do we have any results yet?
We've added a fifth option here on control. I just think we've touched upon it so much in the presentation, we want to make sure that we included it. All right, let's see.
Insights and true insights here. So yes, that's right there.
Wow.
Great. Okay. Well, let's guide the discussion and make sure we talk about these two or three of these concepts that have really come to the forefront. It looks like it was flexibility and visibility, productivity insights, and trust insights coming in at number 1. And then the third, monitoring strategy and capability. So just for the sake of time, Michael, why don't we guide us straight to the productivity insights and trust insights component of this conversation.
Okay. So I got a problem. I've got a problem. What's my problem? I'm going back to the earlier poll where only 1/3 of the people say that they have a way of measuring effectiveness. okay? What's really key here, and it ties into what Gabriela said less than 3 minutes ago, what are the KPIs? What are the KPIs? Are you seeking alignment? How do you correlate the data between employee experience and, say, NPS or customer experience or any of the productivity metrics you use in your organization? Who owns identifying correlations between productivity and employee experience? The second point, and they're related, and shame on us for bundling them, but it's the trust aspect as well, which is, how is trust measured or monitored in this regard? Who owns trust? And this is the one unfair thing I'm going to say. I know that for many people in the call, it's the leadership of the organization that is responsible for how trustworthy or untrustworthy they are. But at a certain point, you have to call this out, because these analytics are not going to work unless people feel they can trust the leadership. So leaders need to articulate, as Gabriela talked about, a trust roadmap. And they need to do so in a way that aligns and reinforces with the productivity measures that matter. Gabriela, you have a couple of examples in this regard, do you not?
Trust roadmap is an interesting one. It sounds very intangible, but in practice, when we think about the trust roadmap, let's give it some color, Michael. I think what it is it's a roadmap, based on trust building actions that leadership and managers take. And so when you think about building that trust roadmap, you need to start with your productivity insights to understand how people are behaving on a routine basis, identify where there are training and development opportunities in the data, where people might potentially be burning out, where you might have wellness concerns, and you need to take those productivity insights, and as a leadership team and as an individual manager, both groups of stakeholders are responsible for saying, I have the data, now I need to see what I can do next to remove the roadblocks in the way for my employees to be productive. And it's the trust roadmap that ultimately becomes a roadmap of a series of actions in which you're taking to improve upon the data that you're seeing in your productivity insights. And so go ahead, Michael.
I'm just going to interject and say that you did allude explicitly. I don't think it's actually that intangible at all. Our managers, as you referenced earlier, and leaders, are they making their dashboards transparent? Can they show, when they do a performance review, how they are using the data they've gathered on teams and individuals to reinforce what you just said, to support the productivity of those teams? I think trust is built from transparency and visibility, and from making accountability clear. So in fact, I think this issue of how do we correlate and establish visible, transparent links between the KPIs that matter and the employee experience we say we want to facilitate, I think that's a big deal. I think that kind of transparency does build trust.
I agree. I think not only are we thinking about using the metrics from a standpoint of conversation, but we're also using them as the baseline from which we decide what actions we take. Julia, I know we're coming in at the end here.
Well, I'm thinking that we have lots of just excellent questions coming in from our audience. And I'm
absolutely
curious if we shift there, and maybe we'll get to exactly what it is that we want to talk about. So let me just go right to the questions here. And I'm going to start with the first question, which is, please define what you think culture is. What definition of culture are you using? My own definition is the sum of behaviors of all employees and managers. What are your thoughts here?
Gabriela, I know that you once worked at McKinsey, so I will use the Marvin Bower, the late, great, wonderful. I actually had the opportunity to meet the gentleman, Marvin Bower. He said, culture is the way we do things around here, okay? And digital transformation fundamentally changes the way we do things around here. That's my definition of culture. I will go with Marvin Bower and McKinsey. To be sure, it's not inconsistent with that definition that we heard about behaviors, because that's the way we do things around here. Gabriela?
Yeah, Michael's pulling from my own textbook, so he takes the answer away from me here.
Ouch.
I would echo, Marvin's definition. I would also say that there's something about culture that to me really ties to it. Then the measurement of culture for me often ties to engagement, right? It's the environment and the way in which things are done that helps define sort of that set of social norms that are taking place within your workplace. And so culture oftentimes isn't something that's dictated by your organization's policies. Instead, it's dictated by the norms that have been established within your organization, oftentimes set not only by leadership, but those that are working at each layer of your organization for some time.
We've also spent a good bit of time today talking about employee experience, and we have a question here. Is this discussion on employee experience only concerned with the so-called white-collar labor force, or are we talking about the full workforce?
Oh my God, I am insulted by that question because in my opening remarks, I explicitly referenced Amazon, Uber, and Clutter. As much as I may have a certain bias to quote unquote white collar / knowledge worker things, virtually every, whoops, I have to virtually every employee has one of these or two of these. So the digitally augmented employee, the digitally augmented worker, the people who were here from Clutter the other day, they took a photo of a box being moved. It was time-stamped and geolocated, all right? This transcends white collar, blue collar, silicon collar distinctions. We care about employee experience for everyone. Trust, accountability, empowerment is for everyone, not just knowledge workers. Forgive the political statement.
In your experience, are there new concepts for what productivity is, how we're defining productivity? This question comes up, or this is the thread in several questions that come up.
Do you want to go first, Gabriela?
Yeah, I'll take that one first. It's a great question and astute for those who are observing in the material that's being proliferated today, the fact that we're talking about productivity in a handful of different ways. Oftentimes when we talk about productivity, we talk about either the input to the productivity or the output of the productivity, when in reality, productivity, through my definition, is a ratio of the two, right? So how much input did you have to put in to generate a level of output? When we think about monitoring, Julia, I'll bring it back to what we're talking about today. That monitoring aspect really sheds light on the inputs that are required for you to generate a level of output. And the reason why it becomes so important to focus on those inputs is because it, of course, allows you to start looking at the leading indicators to what your output eventually be. So let me take that, make that a little bit more applicable to our everyday work. When we look at monitoring metrics, we begin to see the changes in behavior that can indicate things such as dips in engagement, spikes in burnout. Those level of indicators, those inputs to productivity, are going to be what we want to identify as soon as possible so that we can make sure that we're not struggling on what that output ultimately is.
I'm going to both agree and hopefully extend on that. Productivity, don't forget, productivity is almost by definition an industrial era definition. Productivity, and we're talking about the service economy. But what vocabulary as an organizing principle did we talk today? Experience, customer experience, employee experience. We want to improve customer and client experience. Gee, is a good investment for that improving the employee experience? I would say that's a good testable hypothesis. Well, how do we know? We need to measure these things. We need data and analytics to measure these things. If your organization, I'll be more specific, if your leadership cares about customer experience, it needs to care about employee experience. Yes, it needs to care about AI and ML, but it needs to care about employee experience. Who owns alignment between employee experience and customer experience? Okay, that to me is the kind of productivity-oriented question every single board of directors and every single exco doesn't just need to ask, they need to be answering. And I'm happy to say some of the framework we've discussed this morning begins to answer that.
Here we have another question about employee experience. Why not include recruitment and selection in employee experience? They're a full part of the employer-employee journey. Expectations are set in those first moments.
You're correct. Shame on us. We should have included recruiting and onboarding as part of that. We should have been more.
I think we have talent management in there, and so for there that includes from cradle to grave the talent acquisition process, which is recruitment, to onboarding, to performance management, to the final attrition stage.
But I just want to pay a slight compliment to the person asking that question. That's exactly the kind of pushback you want to have. What are we really trying to measure when we talk about employee experience? You know, what's the life cycle aspect from the moment of the recruiter reaching out? Excellent thing. And that's the kind of revisiting the fundamentals and measuring the fundamentals that we revisit that we're encouraging everybody to seriously consider.
Those two, Michael, I would say those are where the milestones really begin, right? From the person's first day to the time that they're dubbed, oftentimes in organizations we hear your first 90 days, right? So when you get to that 91st day and you are officially done with onboarding, it becomes really important to recognize whether or not those 90 days were arbitrary and set based on something we historically set. And so I think what it does is, what I want to highlight is, the talent management process is ridden with milestones with not a lot of insight in terms of what happens between each. And that's where the talent management metrics play so nicely with the monitoring ones. Did that newly hired employee actually become fully functional within their role? Are we seeing them engaged? Are we identifying learning and development opportunities based on how much time they're spending in applications, how much time they're spending trying to learn how to do something, how much time they're spending doing rework? Those are all fantastic indicators that you can glean from monitoring to know whether or not your onboarding process was actually effective.
Well, you both mentioned all of these, benefits of monitoring, and I have to ask this question. This is from our audience. 20 years ago, some call center employees were measured by a problem resolution model of 20 to 30 seconds.
Right.
Can we not be horrified by expanding this kind of tyranny? I am unapologetic about how dramatic this question sounds. And I think as dramatic as that question may sound, it's probably the tone that many leaders are hearing in their own organizations.
So I worked with, back then they were called call centers, contact centers. That was the worst. So there's this thing called Goodhearts Law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. And what people discovered was, you couldn't resolve the thing in under 30 seconds. And the NPS score, the Net Promoter Score, collapsed because you got the impression that the contact center person was trying to get you off the phone, and they were. So you had more sophisticated metrics. First call resolution, better handoff, satisfaction. You didn't just measure them on productivity, number of calls taken. You measured it exactly what Gabriela said at her beginning definition of productivity, what the outputs are. The output is not 30-second completed call, it's a good outcome. So what the person who asked that question, they had, if you'll forgive my technical term of art, crappy managers, crappy leaders, crappy metrics. What can I say? We're encouraging you to take employee experience seriously. Anybody who has a 30-second resolution metric as part of employee experience for a call or contact center, they're not serious people. They're not serious people. And by the way, their churn rate is going to suck. Again, forgive my technical language.
Yeah, my experience is that of what my time over at McDonald's, right? Where you think about how fast you can get someone through the drive-through, a very, very similar concept in which when you're working to get people through that drive-through only to find out that they're coming back and they've got, the wrong burger, an addition of cheese. I said no pickles, right? It's the wrong metric. And I hope that today's conversation only lays the foundation for your organization starting to think about the right metric rather than disproving or feeling as if monitoring isn't necessary at all. I think the idea here is that monitoring is essential. Choosing the right metrics that you're monitoring, reporting out on, and taking action on is even more essential.
No, monitoring is a means to an end. If you have an excellent means to a crappy end, you're screwing yourself. Okay? So what we are really talking about here is aligning useful metrics, a healthy employee experience with a healthy monitoring strategy. Because our view is, if you're not monitoring well, how do you know your metrics are actually on point? But the important thing is exactly what Gabriela said. Are you measuring the right things? Are you measuring the right things?
Well, here's a comment just on that. It says in the market, there's a distinction between talent acquisition and talent management, and often the exit is not monitored or reflected upon. This is one of those metrics that's not looked at. And, according to this comment, can measurement apply here? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. If you think about it, I'm just going to say that every organization that I've been at, and I actually did work in non-academics, there were exit interviews. Now, there are legal issues associated with these things, but I'll go back to McKinsey. McKinsey alumni, people who left McKinsey and went to clients, whatever, they would say nice things about the firm. Do you have boomerang employees? Will your former employees say nice things about you or reference you? These are metrics. What are exit NPSs? Let's call it the NXP, exited employee scores. There are ways of assessing these. I just want to stress that's a completely fair question. And I'm glad that people are doing what Gabriela is suggesting. They're revisiting the fundamentals of the employee experience ecosystem.
What they're also doing, Michael, is they're begging for these not to be disparate topics, right? And so I think in your question alone, Julia, or whoever's question that was, what we're beginning to ask ourselves is, can we move away from these metrics being siloed and start thinking about how they're woven together?
Exactly right.
We have a question here too about, do you have any experience integrating all this information with the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Not sure if you're familiar with these or if that's a question for another time, but I thought I would throw that out there.
I'll make one point. I am working with an organization who shall remain nameless. They one of their goals is to reduce their carbon footprint as part of the UN agreement. So basically travel, they kind of like Zoom and Microsoft Teams because they are using digital as a substitute for carbon footprint for legacy business travel. So it is absolutely possible to incorporate, bring in ESG kind of variables for employee experience. This, by the way, also ties into organizations that want to have purposes beyond, return on investment for shareholders. So the whole notion of stakeholder versus shareholder, yes, if that is going to be a part of the employee experience you wish to create, the question is an absolutely legitimate one. So the answer is yes.
And I have a follow-up question to that. Do you have any rockstar examples of companies that are doing this well? I'm not sure if that refers to the UN Sustainability Development Goals or to employee monitoring as a avenue to empowerment overall.
Well, I'll take the question as the latter, Julia. I think there are a handful of companies that come to mind that are doing this exceptionally well. And I think that they're finding themselves on a path in which their culture has been elevated, the trust that they've established with their employees, and vice versa, has been elevated as well. And so some of the key characteristics to the customers that I'm describing are the idea of putting a program in place with a monitoring strategy before they start thinking about the monitoring capability. As we outlined at the beginning of today's conversation, we talked about this panic that set in. When panic sets in, we immediately go to the tactical. The companies that are doing this well are beginning to get more strategic. They're beginning to think about how this is a cross-functional solve that needs to happen at the leadership level. IT, operations, HR, all three of these key stakeholders are at the table thinking about what type of program needs to be in place as it pertains to monitoring, so that they are not looking back and hoping that they had a trust roadmap, but they're actually looking ahead and they're thinking about the trust roadmap that they're going to execute upon. They're thinking not about necessarily what their monitoring strategy is, but they're thinking about how their employee experience strategy ties together with a monitoring mechanism to bring all of these metrics in place. In short, the companies that are doing this well are thinking more holistically. They're thinking less about the silo and more about the monitoring data as a mechanism to weave other data components together.
Are there any rules that shouldn't be monitored? Sorry, and I'll throw this into you, you can answer it along with, but are there any roles that shouldn't be monitored?
Can I give a interjection to say that I think that's the kind of question leadership that seeks to be more trustworthy should ask of their workforce. In medicine, we have the concept of informed consent. You know, I don't like the web notion of, yes, I agree to have all of these cookies. I think serious organizations say, we would like to monitor this, and in exchange for monitoring, we'll give you this kind of support, this kind of information. I think this is the sort of thing that thoughtful organizations, to quote Gabriela, strategic organizations, negotiate with their employees. If you know, I don't want my bathroom breaks monitored, fine. If I'm working at home, there's a limited amount of invasiveness I want. So I think the notion of what should informed consent around monitoring be when we all have these devices and our laptops and who knows, augmented reality, that's the kind of thing a strategic leader and strategic leadership will emphasize.
Well, Michael, you highlight something really quickly, Julia, just to add. Michael's highlighting something that is important to stress before we conclude here today, which is there isn't a playbook in which we can tell everybody participating today exactly how to do this. There's a step that needs to be taken in which you start engaging with your employees and taking a test of developing an understanding of where your culture is today before you form what is a unique strategy to you. As it comes to using these type of analytics, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, which begs the need to create what's conducive for your environment.
Well, let me ask each of you as we come to the end here, just about out of time and in a tweet-size response, if there's one piece of advice each of you could offer to someone who is just getting started with workplace analytics, what would it be? Gabriela, I'll start with you. Or okay, Michael, go ahead.
Make people partners in their own development.
Mine would be to weave the employee experience data together and have an understanding of what's going on an ongoing basis.
Both excellent pieces of advice. Thank you so much, Gabriela and Michael, it's just been a really interesting and informative talk, and it went way too fast because there's such keen interest here. And thank you to the audience for your attention and all of your great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.